because we've known for a long time it's going to be on May the 6th, was the fact that the word consort has been dropped. And that is sort of like part of a long plan. You know, there's been Operation Camilla, has been in play for quite a long time, ever since she sort of got married to Charles. And
Camilla was never supposed to be queen. Not officially. Not out loud. That was the promise. In 2005, standing beside the man she had loved in secret for over 3 decades, she accepted a title built specifically to avoid the one word Britain could not forgive her for. Princess Consort. Not queen. A compromise. A concession. A quiet admission that the public's wound was still open, and the palace knew it. For 17 years, that promise held. It was repeated in official statements. It was written into royal communications. It was treated, by nearly everyone inside the walls of the institution, as settled fact. But promises made to soothe a grieving public do not always survive contact with time and power, and the slow, patient rewriting of what people are willing to accept. Because in the end, Camilla did not become Princess Consort. She became queen. And the story of how that happened, quietly, deliberately, over 2 decades, reveals something the palace has never fully admitted. That the crown does not simply inherit legitimacy. It has to take it. Sometimes from a woman who has been dead for over 20 years. This is the real story of the title fight nobody was supposed to win.
We meet in times of great uncertainty, in times of conflict from Europe to the Middle East, which pose immense challenges for the international community. We meet too in the aftermath of the incident not far from this great building that sought to harm the leadership of your nation and to foment wider fear and discord. Let me say with unshakable resolve, such acts of violence will never succeed.
Before we go further, it helps to understand something about how the British monarchy actually works, because most people assume titles are handed down by law, fixed and automatic, the same way a house passes to an heir. They are not. A king's wife becomes queen consort by custom, not by statute. There is no act of parliament that says the wife of a reigning king must be called queen. It has simply always happened that way, generation after generation, so consistently that nobody thought to question it. Which means the moment someone chooses to interrupt that custom, for whatever reason, they are not breaking a law. They are breaking a habit. And habits, as it turns out, are far easier to eventually restore than laws are to repeal. That distinction is the entire hidden mechanism of this story. Camilla's title was never protected by anything except public feeling. And public feeling, unlike legislation, changes with time whether anyone intends it to or not. To understand what was actually promised in 2005, you have to understand what came before it. Camilla and Charles's relationship began in the 1970s, long before either of them married anyone else. They met, according to most royal biographers, around 1970 or 1971, at a polo match, introduced by mutual friends in a social circle that revolved around country estates, hunting weekends, and a small, tightly knit aristocratic world where everyone seemed to already know everyone else. Camilla, at the time, was Camilla Shand, the daughter of a wine merchant and war hero, with her own aristocratic lineage running back to a royal mistress from an earlier century, a detail that has fascinated royal historians for decades, because it meant Camilla's family had, in a sense, already had a woman in her position before, generations earlier, quietly connected to the crown without ever wearing it.
How can anybody be worth that much? We're all worth
I, however,
something.
feel there's value in tradition, and I think that's what the Brits really love, is the tradition of the crown, and it has a lot of value to them. So, you know, I support it. I think it's great, but at some point, maybe it becomes a little bit too expensive too.
The connection royal historians so often point back to is Camilla's great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, who was the mistress of King Edward VII in the early 1900s, a relationship that was, at the time, quietly tolerated by the royal household and even, according to some accounts, by Queen Alexandra herself. in a way that later generations found almost impossible to imagine given how differently the same kind of arrangement was treated when it involved Camilla and Charles nearly a century afterward. That historical echo became one of the most repeated footnotes in the entire saga, the idea that Camilla's family had, in effect, walked this road once before, only to have it accepted by an earlier, more discreet era of royal life, an era without tabloids, without television cameras, without a public that expected total visibility into the private lives of the people who governed them. Camilla's own upbringing was comfortable but not aristocratic in the grandest sense. Her father, Bruce Shand, was a decorated cavalry officer who had been taken prisoner during the Second World War, and later ran a wine business in London. Camilla was educated privately in England and briefly in Switzerland and France, in the fairly conventional manner of well-off English families of her generation, without the kind of intense public grooming that shaped Diana's later, far more scrutinized entrance into royal life. By most accounts from people who knew her at the time, Camilla was outgoing, socially confident, and deeply at home in the world of country sports and horses that also defined much of Charles's own social life, a shared interest that reportedly formed much of the foundation of their early friendship. Charles and Camilla's early relationship did not lead to marriage. Charles was sent away on naval service, a common practice for young royal men expected to build a record of duty before settling down, and in his absence, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer she had known for years, in 1973. Parker Bowles himself was, by several accounts, no stranger to the same social circles as Charles, and the two men reportedly maintained a civil, even friendly relationship for years afterward, an oddity that later became one of the more uncomfortable footnotes of the entire story once the affair became public knowledge. The Parker-Bowles marriage would itself later end in divorce, in 1995, 2 years before Diana's death, closing one chapter of the story just as the more public, more consequential chapter was beginning to accelerate. By 1986, according to Charles's own authorized biography, written years later by Jonathan Dimbleby with Charles's cooperation, the affair that would eventually end 2 marriages and reshape the monarchy was already underway. Charles was still married to Diana. Camilla was still married to Andrew Parker Bowles. Neither marriage would survive it. It is worth pausing here, because the timeline matters more than most retellings admit. Charles married Diana in 1981, in a wedding watched by an estimated global television audience in the hundreds of millions, a fairy tale broadcast into homes across the world, a young, glamorous princess stepping into a role the public had already fallen in love with before she ever spoke a public word. Behind that broadcast, a different story was quietly continuing. Diana herself would later say she always felt there were 3 people in her marriage, a phrase that became one of the most quoted lines of the entire saga, and one that permanently altered how the public understood everything that came afterward. When the truth became public, the reaction was not mild disapproval. It was fury. Camilla became, in the eyes of much of the British public, the woman who broke apart the fairy tale. Not a villain in a legal sense. There was no crime. But in the court of public opinion, a verdict had already been reached, and it would take decades to appeal. Diana died in 1997. And for years afterward, Camilla's name could barely be spoken in the same breath as the royal family without triggering outrage. There is a striking asymmetry worth noting here, one that shaped public perception of the entire affair for decades afterward. Both Charles and Diana eventually spoke publicly, on camera, about the collapse of their marriage. Charles admitted to infidelity in a televised interview in 1994, conducted by Jonathan Dimbleby, a moment that shocked much of the country simply by virtue of a royal figure admitting something so personal on record. Diana went further still, in her now famous 1995 Panorama interview with the BBC, watched by an enormous television audience, in which she spoke candidly about her marriage, her mental health struggles, and her belief that she would never be queen. Camilla, by contrast, has never given an equivalent interview. In more than 3 decades of public scrutiny, she has never sat down for a televised confession, never issued a detailed public statement addressing the affair directly, never offered the kind of raw, unfiltered account that both Charles and Diana eventually did. Her approach, whether by instinct or deliberate strategy, was silence, and decades of simply enduring public judgment without attempting to publicly litigate her own side of the story.
balances. America's words carry weight and meaning, as they have since independence. The actions of this great nation matter even more. I pray with all my heart that our alliance will continue to defend our shared values with our partners in Europe and the Commonwealth and across the world.
Royal biographers have long debated whether that silence helped or hurt her in the long run, but there is at least a reasonable case that it left her with far less material for the public to hold against her than either Charles or Diana ultimately provided about themselves. So when Charles and Camilla finally married in 2005, 8 years after Diana's death, the palace did not simply announce a wedding. It managed one. Every detail was calculated to avoid reopening a wound that had never fully closed. The wedding itself was almost aggressively low-key by royal standards, a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall rather than a grand cathedral service, a choice that came with its own complications, since a civil marriage for the heir to the throne raised genuine constitutional and religious questions inside the Church of England, an institution Charles was destined to eventually head as supreme governor. Lawyers and clergy spent months quietly working through whether a civil ceremony was even appropriate, given that the Church of England had historically discouraged remarriage after divorce for anyone connected to the Church's leadership. In the end, a solution was found. The legal marriage happened in a civil register office. Afterward, a service of prayer and dedication was held at St. George's Chapel, blessing the union without technically remarrying them in a religious sense, a careful, almost surgical distinction that allowed the Archbishop of Canterbury to participate without appearing to contradict church tradition. Even the guest list and the Queen's own attendance were handled with unusual care. Queen Elizabeth II did not attend the civil ceremony itself, a decision widely reported at the time as reflecting her own discomfort, as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, with being seen at a civil wedding for the heir to the throne, though she did attend the church blessing that followed at St. George's Chapel, along with a reception afterward at Windsor Castle. That distinction, present but not present, attending the religious blessing while staying away from the legal ceremony, was itself read by royal watchers as a carefully calculated signal, the Queen extending just enough visible support to legitimize the union without fully erasing the discomfort many in the country, and reportedly within the family itself, still felt about it. Prince William and Prince Harry, then in their early 20s, did attend, standing beside their father in a public show of support that royal commentators at the time treated as significant precisely because it was not guaranteed. Neither Diana's family nor Camilla's first husband's side of the story played any visible role in the day, and the entire event was staged with a level of restraint almost unheard of for a royal wedding. No grand procession through London, no lavish televised broadcast on the scale of Charles and Diana's 1981 wedding, just a quiet, deliberately modest affair designed to draw as little comparison as possible to the marriage it was, in the public imagination, always going to be measured against. Camilla did not take the title Princess of Wales, the title that belonged to Diana in the public's memory forever. She became Duchess of Cornwall instead, using one of Charles's secondary titles rather than his primary one, a deliberate sidestep that let the public keep Diana's most famous title untouched, almost sacred, unused by anyone else for the rest of Charles's time as heir. And Clarence House went further still, announcing that when Charles became king, Camilla would not be queen. She would be known as Princess Consort, a title with no real precedent, invented for one specific purpose: to make her acceptable without making her equal to the woman she had replaced. Constitutional experts at the time of the 2005 announcement pointed out something that rarely made it into the popular coverage but mattered enormously to how the promise was actually understood inside the institution. Princess Consort was not simply a smaller version of Queen Consort. It had no real legal or historical grounding at all. Every previous wife of a reigning king in modern British history had automatically become Queen Consort upon her husband's accession, a custom so consistent that no monarch had ever felt the need to invent an alternative. Camilla's title was, in that sense, not a downgrade drawn from precedent, but an entirely new category invented from scratch, purely to solve a public relations problem that had no real historical parallel. Some constitutional scholars argued at the time that Charles, as king, would not even have had a straightforward legal mechanism to formally deny his wife the title of queen, since the title arises from marriage to the monarch by long-standing custom rather than by any statute that could simply be amended to exclude her. What this meant, in practice, was that Princess Consort was never quite as solid a promise as it appeared to be in 2005. It rested almost entirely on voluntary restraint. An agreement to simply not use the title Camilla was, technically, already entitled to by the same customary logic that had granted it to every royal wife before her. That legal ambiguity is part of why so many royal historians were, in hindsight, far less surprised by the eventual reversal than the general public was. The promise had always been softer than it sounded. It was a promise. And for years, the palace repeated it, as recently as March 2020, less than 3 years before Charles took the throne. Royal correspondents at the time treated the phrase almost as boilerplate, a line repeated in official biographies of Camilla, in briefings to journalists, in the institutional memory of an organization that prides itself on precedent and continuity. Nobody inside the palace, at least publicly, suggested the title was temporary or negotiable. It was simply understood as settled. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had been in that position, given a promise designed to protect someone else's memory, would you have wanted to keep it? Or would you have wanted, eventually, the full title that came with the marriage? Type your honest answer in the comments. One word is enough. Yes or no? And if this story has already pulled you in, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the next 20 years to that promise is going to surprise you. Because something did happen. Slowly. Almost invisibly, if you weren't paying attention. Public opinion of Camilla did not stay frozen in 2005. It shifted. Charity work. Consistency. Decades of showing up to the unglamorous parts of royal duty that rarely make headlines. She took on patronages connected to causes that were, for a long time, considered too uncomfortable for polite royal conversation, including domestic abuse and sexual assault support organizations, work she continued for years without much press attention, long before it became fashionable for royals to speak openly about difficult subjects. She became president of organization supporting osteoporosis research, a cause connected to her own mother's death from the disease, and she kept showing up to those engagements year after year, in a way that royal watchers eventually noticed had less to do with image management and more to do with simple, repeated presence. Beyond the charity work itself, Camilla also gradually took on a more visible role in specific cultural spaces that had nothing to do with royal formality at all, and everything to do with simply being seen as a person with genuine interests. She became a well-known champion of literacy and reading, hosting literary lunches at Clarence's house that brought together authors, publishers, and readers in a setting that had little to do with traditional royal pageantry and much more to do with an ordinary, recognizable enthusiasm for books. She spoke openly, in interviews given over the years, about her own love of reading, and the initiative she eventually built around it, sometimes referred to informally as her Reading Room Project, became one of the more distinctive, personally driven contributions she made to public life, separate from anything connected to Charles or the wider institution. Small, specific details like this, an interest that had nothing to do with redemption or image repair, mattered more to the slow rebuilding of public goodwill than almost any single formal gesture the palace could have staged, precisely because they read as genuine rather than strategic. Polling on Camilla's public image, tracked periodically by British polling organisations over the years, showed a gradual, almost imperceptible climb. It was never dramatic. There was no single moment where the country collectively decided to forgive her. It was closer to erosion in reverse, approval accumulating in small increments, year after year, the way trust generally rebuilds after it has been broken, not in a single gesture but in thousands of small, boring, consistent ones. By the time Queen Elizabeth II reached her Platinum Jubilee in 2022, 70 years on the throne, something had changed in how Britain saw the woman who had once been treated as an intruder.
Obviously, unless you're in front of her, we will still say Camilla when we're talking about her. You know what I mean? I don't think we'll say Queen Camilla or... but, you know, I think you've got a king and he's married, she's got to be the queen. But it is weird because I feel that we're all still in mourning for that queen title. You know, it feels like it was yesterday when we lost our queen. So
Anne Elizabeth noticed. In February 2022, just months before her own death, the Queen made a statement that quietly detonated the promise made 17 years earlier. She wrote of her sincere wish that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known not as Princess Consort, but as Queen Consort. One sentence. From the one person whose word could actually override a promise made in her name. And it changed everything. Because Elizabeth was not simply expressing a preference. She was closing a door that had been propped open for 17 years, the door that let Camilla's title remain smaller than her marriage. The late Queen chose the final months of her life to settle a question the monarchy had spent 2 decades avoiding. The context surrounding Elizabeth's health in this period matters as much as the statement itself. Prince Philip, her husband of over 70 years, had died in April 2021, just months before her Platinum Jubilee planning began in earnest, leaving Elizabeth to navigate the final phase of her reign without the partner who had stood beside her for the entirety of it. Her own health, meanwhile, had begun visibly declining through late 2021 and into 2022, with palace statements increasingly citing mobility issues that limited her ability to travel or stand for extended periods, forcing her to withdraw from a growing list of engagements she would once have attended without hesitation. Against that backdrop, the Jubilee statement reads less like a routine announcement and more like a woman consciously using one of her final moments of full public authority to settle a matter she clearly considered unfinished business before the responsibility for making that decision passed, inevitably, to someone else. It is worth asking why Elizabeth chose that particular moment. She was 95 years old, dealing with mobility issues that had already forced her to withdraw from most public appearances, and by the time of the Jubilee celebrations that summer, she was too unwell to attend most of the events held in her own honor. There is a reading of this moment that suggests Elizabeth understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, that this might be one of her last opportunities to settle unfinished business on her own terms, rather than leaving it for Charles to resolve, awkwardly, in the earliest and most fragile days of his own reign, when any change to Camilla's title risked looking self-interested rather than earned. By making the statement herself, in her own name, at the height of a celebration devoted to her 70 years of service, Elizabeth effectively transferred her own accumulated public goodwill onto Camilla's title, lending it a legitimacy that Charles alone could never have manufactured, no matter how carefully he tried. Charles became king 7 months later. And by the time of his coronation in 2023, something else had happened, something even the Jubilee statement had not fully predicted. The word consort disappeared entirely. Quietly. Without a formal announcement built around it. Official communication simply began referring to her as Queen Camilla. Not Queen Consort. Just Queen. The coronation itself, held in May 2023 at Westminster Abbey, offered its own quiet signal about how far the institution was willing to go. Camilla was crowned in the same ceremony as Charles, anointed and consecrated in a religious rite largely unchanged for centuries, using a crown, Queen Mary's crown, that had been altered for the occasion rather than commissioned new, a practical decision framed publicly as a matter of sustainability and modesty, but one that also, deliberately or not, avoided the far more controversial option of using a crown containing the coin of diamond, a stone whose ownership has been disputed for generations between Britain and multiple countries, most prominently India, and whose use at a coronation broadcast to a global audience would have reignited an entirely different and far thornier controversy. The choice to sidestep that entirely, and instead simply modify an existing crown already associated with a respected former queen, was, in its own quiet way, another example of the same instinct that shaped the entire Camilla story. Avoid the controversy where possible. Let time and careful management do the rest. The title Camilla was never supposed to have was now hers completely. And the public's reaction to that final step tells you almost everything about how much had actually changed, and how much never really did. Some people barely blinked. Others felt something closer to betrayal, a promise broken twice over, first when consort was added, and again when it was quietly removed. Newspaper comment sections and social media in the days following the coronation showed both reactions playing out side by side, sometimes within the same family, the same friend group, the same generation. Older royal watchers who remembered 2005 vividly tended to notice the shift more sharply than younger audiences who had never known a version of Camilla that wasn't simply Charles's wife, quietly present at his side for as long as they could remember. It is also worth remembering that this entire question was never purely a domestic British matter. Charles's title as king, and by extension Camilla's title as queen, applies across the Commonwealth realms, the group of independent nations, from Canada to Australia to Jamaica, that still recognize the British monarch as their own head of state. That meant the decision about what to call Camilla was never simply a matter of British public opinion alone. It had to be workable across multiple countries, multiple governments, and multiple, sometimes very different, levels of enthusiasm for the monarchy itself. Some of those nations have, in recent years, held their own public debates about whether to remain constitutional monarchies at all, debates that exist entirely separate from the Camilla title question but that nonetheless form part of the backdrop against which the palace made its decisions. A prolonged, messy public fight over what to call the king's wife was, from that broader vantage point, exactly the kind of distraction the institution could least afford at a moment when its own relevance in several Commonwealth nations was already being actively questioned. If you are the kind of person who believes promises made to protect someone's memory should be kept no matter how much time passes, or if you believe the living deserve to move forward on their own terms, this story is about to test that belief. Stay with it, because what comes next, the years of public hostility Camilla actually had to survive to get here, is the part most people never hear told properly. Subscribe now if you don't want to miss where this goes. Because winning a title is one thing. Surviving the years before it is another story entirely. Camilla's title did not arrive by accident. It arrived because she survived something first. Something that lasted almost 30 years and very nearly destroyed her. Long before she was queen, before she was even welcome in most conversations about the royal family, Camilla was simply the woman blamed for ending a fairy tale. Her affair with Charles, confirmed publicly in the 1990s, did not stay a private matter. It became one of the most scrutinized relationships in modern royal history, and Camilla bore the weight of it in a way Charles largely did not. Think about that for a second. Two people. One affair. And only one of them became a national villain. There is a reason for that imbalance, and it has less to do with fairness than with how the public tends to process betrayal inside a story it has already fallen in love with. Diana was, by 1992, arguably the most photographed woman in the world, a figure whose warmth, informality, and visible emotional openness had made her enormously sympathetic to a public that had grown used to a more distant, reserved royal family. When it became clear that her marriage was unraveling, and that another woman had been present throughout much of it, public anger needed somewhere to land. Charles, as the heir to the throne, was in some ways too central to the institution itself to absorb the full weight of that anger without threatening the monarchy's stability directly. Camilla, an outsider by comparison, someone the public did not already have a relationship with, became the far safer, far more available target. Diana's death in 1997 made it worse. Much worse. In the raw grief that followed, Camilla's name became something close to unspeakable in polite company. Tabloids ran with it. Strangers on the street were openly hostile. There are accounts of her being heckled in public, of needing security simply to walk from a car to a building. This was not mild disapproval. This was sustained, personal, national anger, directed at one woman for nearly a decade. One widely reported incident from the period captured the mood as clearly as anything else could. During a supermarket visit not long after news of the affair had broken publicly, a bag of flour was reportedly thrown at Camilla's car by a bystander, an act small in itself but symbolically enormous, a stranger deciding that the appropriate response to a public figure's private life was physical confrontation in a parking lot. Stories like that circulated widely at the time, becoming part of the informal, unofficial record of just how personal and immediate the hostility toward Camilla actually was, not confined to newspaper columns and talk shows but present in ordinary, everyday interactions. By the time she and Charles married in 2005, the palace was not just managing a wedding. It was managing a wound. And that is precisely why Camilla was given a title smaller than the one she was legally entitled to. Princess Consort was never really about tradition. It was about survival. Hers and the monarchy's. Here's a question. If millions of strangers hated you for something you did decades ago, and time slowly started to forgive you, would you eventually want the full recognition you'd earned? Or would guilt keep you asking for less than you deserved? Drop your honest answer below. This is the kind of story where the comments are almost as interesting as the script. Because the hostility did not end at the wedding. It followed Camilla for years afterward, quieter now, but still present. And nowhere was that tension more personal, more difficult to hide, than inside the family itself. William and Harry grew up watching their mother be publicly humiliated by their father's affair. That is not speculation. It is well documented, both in their own later interviews and in decades of royal reporting. Diana herself spoke publicly about the affair before her death, describing the pain of a marriage she felt she was never fully part of. Her sons inherited that pain, whether anyone intended them to or not. For years, palace insiders and royal biographers described a careful, deliberate strategy to introduce Camilla into William and Harry's lives slowly, cautiously, without ever forcing affection that could not be genuine. There was no press conference declaring reconciliation. There was, instead, a long, quiet process of proximity. Family events. Shared occasions. Time. Reports from the late 1990s and early 2000s described this process unfolding almost entirely away from cameras, deliberately so, because any staged or premature photograph of the boys with Camilla would have been read by the public as forced, artificial, an attempt to manufacture forgiveness that hadn't actually happened yet. Royal aides at the time reportedly worked to ensure that the first meetings between Camilla and the young princes happened privately, at Charles's residence, without press notification, giving the relationship room to develop without the added pressure of national scrutiny on every gesture, every expression, every small interaction. Harry, in particular, has spoken candidly in later years about how difficult that adjustment was. Not hatred exactly. Something closer to grief colliding with obligation. A son trying to reconcile loyalty to a mother who was gone with a father who had moved on. In interviews and in his own later memoir, Harry described complicated feelings about Camilla over the years, acknowledging both the difficulty of the adjustment and, eventually, a kind of grudging acceptance that softened, though not without real friction, especially as tensions between Harry and the rest of the family grew more public in later years for reasons that extended well beyond Camilla herself. William's public relationship with Camilla, by contrast, tended to be reported as somewhat steadier over time, marked by fewer publicized moments of tension, though royal correspondents have long cautioned that the actual texture of these family relationships is far harder to know from outside than headlines suggest. What both princes shared, according to most accounts, was the basic, unavoidable reality of growing up as the children of one of the most publicly dissected divorces in modern history, with a stepmother whose very presence was, for years, treated by large parts of the public as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Harry's 2023 memoir, Spare, added new detail to this long, mostly private process, describing his own complicated emotional reaction to his father's relationship with Camilla in language far more direct than anything the family had previously allowed into public view. The book described tension not only around the relationship itself but around the broader dynamics of how the family navigated press coverage and public image during those years, tension that extended well beyond Camilla specifically but that inevitably kept her at the center of much of the discussion, given how closely her own rise was tied to the family's most difficult period. William, for his part, has been notably more restrained in public comments about the subject over the years, generally avoiding the kind of direct, personal reflection Harry offered, a difference in approach that royal commentators have often linked to the broader difference in how the two brothers have chosen to relate to the institution itself, William remaining fully inside its structures and expectations, Harry eventually stepping outside them altogether. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told properly, because it does not involve a single dramatic confrontation. It involves 20 years of small, difficult, human moments, add up slowly, the way real healing usually does. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't do shallow royal gossip. We do the version backed by fact, the version with real sourcing behind it. If that's worth something to you, subscribing costs nothing, and it tells us you want more stories told this way instead of the recycled headlines everyone else is copying and pasting. By the early 2020s, something had shifted. Camilla's public standing, once toxic, had become something closer to accepted. Charity work. Decades of quiet consistency. A public that, slowly, had started separating the woman from the scandal that once defined her. Part of this shift can be traced to a broader cultural change in how divorce, remarriage, and blended families came to be viewed in British society more generally over the same 30-year period. The country that reacted with such fury to Charles and Camilla's affair in the early 1990s was, by the 2020s, a country in which divorce, second marriages, and complicated family histories had become simply ordinary, unremarkable facts of life for a huge portion of the population. The moral framework that had once made Camilla so easy to condemn had itself softened considerably over the decades, not because of anything Camilla did specifically, but because the society judging her had changed the terms of its own judgment. Media coverage itself played a quiet, often underestimated role in this shift. In the immediate aftermath of Diana's death, British newspapers, many of which had spent years running deeply unflattering coverage of Camilla, faced significant public criticism for their own role in the culture of intrusive royal reporting that many blamed, at least in part, for the circumstances surrounding Diana's fatal car crash in Paris, which occurred while being pursued by photographers. That criticism appears to have produced a genuine, if gradual, shift in how at least some outlets approached coverage of Camilla in the years that followed, moving away from the more openly hostile framing of the 1990s toward coverage that increasingly emphasized her charity work, her steady presence at Charles's side, and eventually her own personality and interests, presented in a much more sympathetic register than anything published about her in the decade before. Royal correspondents who covered both eras have often pointed to this shift in press tone as one of the quieter, less discussed engines behind the broader change in public sentiment, since so much of how the British public came to understand Camilla over the decades was mediated through exactly the same newspapers that had once treated her so harshly. There is also the simple, unglamorous factor of time itself. Diana died in 1997. By the time of Elizabeth's Jubilee statement in 2022, 25 years had passed, long enough for an entire generation to grow up with only distant, second-hand knowledge of the original scandal, absorbed through documentaries and retrospectives rather than lived experience. For a meaningful portion of the British public by 2022, particularly younger viewers, Camilla was simply the King's wife, a familiar, unremarkable presence, not a wound still actively being processed in real time. And then came the moment that changed everything permanently. In February 2022, during her Platinum Jubilee, Queen Elizabeth II did something she had never done before. She addressed the succession directly, in writing, in her own words. She stated it was her sincere wish that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. Sit with that for a second. The most powerful woman in the country, 70 years into her reign, choosing one of her final public statements to settle a question the monarchy had avoided for 17 years. It was not a small gesture. It was Elizabeth using the full weight of her authority to override a promise made in her name back in 2005. She was, in effect, telling the country that the wound had healed enough. That Camilla had earned what she had once been asked to go without. There is another layer to this worth considering. Elizabeth's own reign had been shaped, from its very beginning, by a family history full of complicated marriages and difficult public reckonings, from her own uncle's abdication over his desire to marry a divorced woman, to her sister's painful, publicly scrutinized romance that never led to marriage, to the string of royal divorces that marked the 1990s, including her own son's. Elizabeth had spent 70 years watching the institution wrestle, again and again, with the tension between rigid tradition and simple human reality. By 2022, in the twilight of her own reign, she may well have understood better than anyone that continuing to withhold a title from Camilla indefinitely no longer served any purpose except prolonging a wound that both the family and the public had, by then, largely moved past. 7 months later, Elizabeth was gone. And the promise she made in that statement became reality. At Charles's coronation in 2023, the title was already shifting again, this time in a direction almost nobody had predicted. Consort quietly disappeared from official language altogether. Not through some grand announcement. Through simple, repeated usage. Queen Camilla. Not Queen Consort Camilla. Just Queen. Royal commentators at the time offered a range of explanations for why the shortened form took hold so quickly and so completely. Some pointed out that official usage in Commonwealth realms and international diplomatic correspondence tends, over time, to favour the simplest available form of a title, and that Queen Camilla was simply easier to use consistently across headlines, official documents, and everyday conversation than the longer Queen Consort Camilla. Others suggested something less mechanical was happening, that the dropping of consort reflected a deliberate, if quiet, institutional decision to fully normalise Camilla's position rather than leave her permanently marked as a lesser or secondary version of the title, a distinction that, once made unnecessary by shifting public opinion, no longer served the monarchy's interests to maintain. The coronation weekend itself was not without visible dissent. Anti-monarchy protesters, organised under groups campaigning for the abolition of the monarchy altogether, gathered along the procession route holding signs reading "Not My King," and several were arrested in the hours before the ceremony under recently expanded public order laws, arrests that themselves became a significant news story in the days that followed, drawing criticism from civil liberties groups who argued the arrests raised troubling questions about the right to peaceful protest. That controversy, while not directly about Camilla, became part of the broader atmosphere surrounding the entire event, a reminder that even as the institution quietly resolved a 2-decade-old title question in Camilla's favour, it was simultaneously facing a very different, more fundamental challenge from a portion of the public that questioned whether the monarchy should continue to exist in its current form at all. Camilla's crowning, in that sense, happened not against a backdrop of universal celebration, but against a far more mixed, complicated national mood, one in which support for the institution itself, not just for her personal title, could no longer be assumed the way it once was. The title she was never supposed to have in 2005 was now hers completely, unshortened, unqualified, exactly equal in wording to every queen who had worn it before her. Some royal watchers barely reacted. Others felt it as one final, quiet erasure of the promise made to protect Diana's memory. Both reactions were real. Both are still playing out in public opinion today. It is worth noting, too, that this entire arc unfolded without a single formal vote, referendum, or piece of legislation. No parliamentary debate decided that Camilla should be called Queen rather than Princess Consort. No court ruled on it. The entire transformation happened through a combination of one dying monarch's written wish, decades of accumulated public tolerance, and the quiet, incremental habits of official language, three forces that, together, proved far more powerful than any formal promise made in 2005 ever could have anticipated. Because here is what almost nobody says out loud about this story. Camilla's title was never really decided by law. There is no statute that dictates whether she gets called queen or consort or princess. It was decided, every step of the way, by public tolerance, and by one woman's willingness to wait nearly 2 decades to receive it. That waiting is, in some ways, the most underappreciated part of the entire story. Nearly every retelling focuses on the eventual outcome, the crown, the title, the coronation, because outcomes make for a cleaner narrative than decades of uncertainty. But for most of the years between 2005 and 2022, Camilla had no guarantee that Princess Consort would ever change. She simply continued showing up, year after year, to charity engagements and state visits and quiet, unglamorous royal duties, with no promise that any of it would eventually be rewarded with a different word attached to her name. Whether that patience was strategic, genuine, or some combination of both is something only Camilla herself could truly answer, and it is not something she has ever addressed directly and publicly in any detailed way. Britain is far from the only monarchy to have quietly navigated a question like this one. Across Europe, several reigning royal families have, at various points, worked through similar tensions between formal titles and public sentiment following divorce or remarriage, each managing the balance between tradition and public feeling in its own way. What sets the British case apart is less the underlying dilemma, which is a fairly universal challenge for any hereditary institution built on public affection as much as legal authority, and more the sheer duration and visibility of the process, stretched out over nearly 2 decades in full view of a global media apparatus with no real equivalent in earlier eras, when similar adjustments were often made far more quietly, sometimes simply by never being formally acknowledged in the first place. Camilla's story may be unusual in its details, but the underlying pattern, an institution adjusting its own rules gradually enough that the adjustment barely registers as a break with tradition, is closer to how monarchies have generally managed change than most outside observers assume. If Charles dies before Camilla does, her title changes one final time. Official guidance released around the time of the coronation indicated that Camilla would continue to be known simply as Queen Camilla, following a precedent set by the late Queen Mother, who was never widely referred to by the more traditional Dowager Queen title after the death of her husband, King George VI, precisely because that phrasing had, by then, come to sound antiquated and was felt to create public confusion during a period when there could otherwise be two queens referred to simultaneously, the reigning queen and the widow of the previous king. This detail matters because it shows that even the future handling of Camilla's title has already been shaped by the same instinct that guided her rise to queen in the first place, a preference for simplicity, familiarity, and avoiding any language that might reopen old wounds or invite unnecessary controversy. And when that day comes, another woman steps into the role Camilla currently holds. Catherine, Princess of Wales, becomes the next Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, a title she is expected to carry from the very beginning of William's reign, without the decades-long delay and title substitution that defined Camilla's path. Which raises a question worth thinking about right now, before that day ever arrives. Catherine has watched this entire story unfold from close range, the hostility, the slow forgiveness, the eventual title. Will her own path to that same word be anything like Camilla's? Or will everything the public just witnessed change how fast, and how easily, she's allowed to wear it? There is good reason to think Catherine's path will look almost nothing like Camilla's, if only because the circumstances that shaped Camilla's title were so specific to her own story, an affair, a death that reshaped public memory permanently, and a decades-long process of rebuilding trust that had never existed in the first place. Catherine, by contrast, entered public life without any of that baggage, marrying William in 2011 after a long, well-documented courtship that the public largely embraced from the beginning. Whatever challenges Catherine's own path to the title of Queen eventually holds, they are unlikely to mirror Camilla's in scale or origin. But that does not mean her path will be free of scrutiny entirely, only that the scrutiny is likely to take a different shape altogether. That is the story we're telling next. And there is one detail in it, something Catherine has already quietly done that almost nobody has connected to this history yet, that changes how you'll see everything that happened here. You will not want to miss it. Subscribe now, so it lands in front of you the moment it's ready. Before you go, it's worth stepping back and asking what this entire saga actually reveals about the monarchy as an institution, beyond the specifics of one woman's title. The lesson, if there is one, is that the British royal family survives not by rigidly enforcing every promise it ever makes, but by carefully, patiently managing which promises get quietly retired once they've served their purpose. Princess Consort was never meant to be permanent in the way most people assumed. It was meant to buy time, time for public anger to cool, time for a new generation to grow up without the same raw memory of Diana's death, time for Camilla herself to prove, through decades of unglamorous, repetitive public service, that she was not simply the villain of someone else's tragedy. Whether that makes the institution deeply pragmatic or quietly manipulative probably depends on how much faith you already have in the monarchy to begin with. What is much harder to argue with is the outcome itself. A promise made in 2005 to protect the memory of a woman who had already been dead for 8 years was, over the following 2 decades, gradually unmade, not through any dramatic reversal, but through the accumulated weight of ordinary time passing, one charity visit, one quiet family gathering, one incremental shift in public sentiment at a time, until one day, without any single announcement marking the moment, the word consort simply wasn't there anymore. That is how titles actually change inside an institution built on the appearance of permanence. Not all at once. Not through confrontation. But slowly, deliberately, and almost always in a direction that the public barely notices until it has already happened. There is also a question of how history will eventually settle on this story, once enough time has passed that it stops being current events and starts being simply the record. future royal biographers, writing decades from now with none of the emotional immediacy that shaped coverage in the 1990s and early 2000s, may well treat Camilla's path to the title of Queen as a fairly unremarkable footnote. One more example of a monarchy adjusting its own internal rules to fit the reality of a long marriage, rather than the decades-long, emotionally fraught saga it actually was for everyone who lived through it in real time. That is, in a sense, the final irony of the entire story. The very passage of time that eventually delivered Camilla her title is the same force that will likely, eventually, flatten the controversy surrounding it into a minor historical detail, remembered mostly by the generation that watched it unfold, rather than by the generations that come after. For now, though, the story remains vivid, contested, and very much alive in public memory, precisely because so many of the people who watched Diana's wedding in 1981, who mourned her death in 1997, and who resented the compromise offered in 2005, are still here, still watching, still forming opinions about whether what happened between then and Charles's 2023 coronation represents patience finally rewarded or a promise slowly, deliberately unmade. Both readings are available. Both are, in their own way, defensible. And the fact that the palace itself has never fully addressed which one is closer to the truth is, perhaps, the most telling detail of all. So, was Camilla's rise to Queen a story of patience finally rewarded, or a promise quietly broken twice over? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and if you want the next chapter of this story, the one about Catherine, the title she's already quietly preparing to inherit, and the detail almost nobody has connected until now, make sure you're subscribed, because that story is coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends.